class. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about reflective writing. You're doing a good job in your journals, but I feel like you could do better. And when I say better, I don't mean necessarily for my benefit. I mean better for your own benefit. I think you'll get more out of it if you can get a little bit more deeply into some of the questions that I'm asking you. And my guess is that some of you don't have much experience doing reflective writing, or maybe it has to do with the prompts that I'm giving you. But I just wanted to give you some tips. So I've written out some ideas to help you think more about reflective writing. Things like, I think one of the biggest issues for the stuff that you're turning in is that you're, maybe it's because of the length of the pieces that you're writing, but you're tending to just sort of write in general about things and using abstract concepts. And I'd like to see you do more work to try to tie those abstract and general concepts down to the real world, down to real experience, real stories, real people. So giving more examples to illustrate. I know you have those examples and illustrations in your own mind because you've had these experiences, but I want you to get them down on paper. Forcing yourself to do that that explaining and elaborating and illustrating will really help you deepen your own reflection, because it will help you make new discoveries about things that you didn't even know that you were thinking. And also it will make it so that I can give you more feedback. But way more importantly, it will help you deepen your understanding, make more connections, integrate your knowledge and your experience. So I wanted to just give you an example of how I might do that. So for last week's journal, it asked you to think about where your ideas about service came from, what people in your life influenced how you saw the concept of service, and then to think about how the culture and ethnicity of those people reflect back to this idea of service. So I was just thinking about my own experience when I was reading your journals, and I grew up in the Midwest in a rural setting. My family is Caucasian, specifically I come from Norwegian immigrants, farmers, and so I was thinking about like how did I learn about service, and where did some of those ideas and values come from? And so certainly I learned about service from watching my parents, who were very active in our community. Part of, I think, where that value system came from is that we belonged to a church, and the church was, most churches are very, in Christian churches, have some element of service, both to people within the church setting, helping people who, like every Sunday somebody would stand up to talk about who was having trouble, like who could use some more help, who was in the hospital. So there were those kinds of experiences, but also there were often, fundraisers and other mission type work that we would do. So those kinds of things. I grew up seeing the adults in my church doing types of service, both for the community within the church, but also in the larger community, even in other countries, doing missionary work. And then I saw my parents, who were active members both in the church and in the community. My father was, both of my parents were teachers. They belonged to the teachers union. For a while, my dad was an officer in the union. And so I grew up seeing those experiences, watching my dad organize for the union, fight for teachers' working rights. And so that had a big impact on me, seeing those kinds of things. Also, I think growing up in a rural setting where your neighbors lived like a quarter of a mile away, and the police and other services were not readily available, neighbors had to sort of look out for each other. And even though they didn't necessarily hang out together all the time, there's just a different ethos, I think, and a different way of being when you live in a rural setting. Um, you're it's an interesting paradox that you're both sort of removed from each other because you're not up in each other's business all the time, but you actually, I feel like I knew more about my neighbors when I lived in the country than I do about my neighbors who live in the city, who are, so close I can almost reach out the window and touch them. But there's not that sense that I'm as responsible for them because there are other services available. The police are, 2 minutes away. The fire department's 1 minute away. So it's just a really different way of operating. So I feel like that, growing up in that setting, sort of influenced the way I thought about community and how we're responsible for helping each other, looking out for our neighbors. I also recently read a book about Norwegian immigrants in the Midwest. It's this great book called something about giants in the earth, and it's a fictional story, but it's about it's a well-researched historical fiction about Norwegian immigrants who settled in the Dakota Territory in the mid to late 1800s. And in reading that story, it occurred to me that I wondered if some of the value systems that I grew up with, because a lot of the people in where I grew up had ancestry that was similar to mine, of immigrants moving and settling the prairies of the Midwest. And in that book, it was really clear that at the time that those places were being settled, there were no services. You absolutely had to rely on your neighbor if your husband died, or if your cow died, or if your child got sick, if your crop failed. There was nobody else to help you but your neighbors. And because the neighbors depended on each other in order to have a healthy community, it was just a given that people shared and took care of each other. And so I wonder if that experience maybe influenced the way people from my community operated. And then just lastly, just examples, and I'm not going to keep going on and on, but examples of other people that I've studied. When I was in college, I studied civil rights movement. Certainly I read books about Martin Luther King Jr. and about Malcolm X. And so I had experiences of looking really specifically at their experiences as community leaders and how their cultural background influenced their sense of what service meant, and what their sense of social justice and social change, and the ways, they certainly, Malcolm X and MLK Jr. had really different ideas about how social change happens. So those were also influential to me as an adult, reading about their experiences. So anyway, that is an example of what I'm talking about. Really getting specific, detailed, thinking about, and I could have gotten even more detailed by talking about even specific stories. Like, there was this one time that my dad did this thing, and I had this moment where I realized blah, blah, blah. So that's what I'm talking about. Taking these general ideas, being more specific, and elaborating more on what you mean. So I hope this is helpful. Sorry to go on and on and on, but I just wanted to give you my observations, and again, try to get a little more deeply into the reflection, since that's the main work that you're doing for the class. Certainly your volunteer experience is the most important work you're doing for the class, but in order to get what I hope you get out of it for the class, this reflection is really the important way that you integrate that experience and get something more out of it than just working in the field. So hope you're having a great week. Let me know if you have any questions. If you need more detailed feedback, I'm happy to do that too.